Okay. I'll share the screen. All right. I hope everybody's seeing She's Old Friends in Iowa. Are you all seeing that?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Good. Then I thought I'd throw this in. I've been holding it ever since she came to San Francisco. I thought, and just one small little human interest part of it, she met with what he called old friends in Iowa. And an old friend means something in Chinese parlance. I guess it depends what character you use, but old friend and the way he was describing it was culturally significant. So he was sending a message back to the Chinese that he was there with old friends. And this is unusual. Digging around and pulling on that thread, I kept getting more and more fabric. So his father, who marched with Mao and was one of the original revolutionaries, and he was with Mao in 1949 when they declared independence. And that makes, since she is Xi Jinping's son, that makes Xi Jinping a princeling. That's what they use for the term of the children of the original revolutionaries. And Xi Jinping's father, this guy, also went to Iowa, believe it or not. He before he went to Iowa, he was a victim of the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping's father was. And that meant the whole family got sent down. Sent down means going and made to work in a communal farm in the rural parts of China. And Xi Jinping has written about that in his biography, that his father was a target of the Cultural Revolution. But he made a recovery as one of Deng Xiaoping's buddies, and he visited Iowa in 1980. And he described just a garden variety trip, a barbecue, and a tractor factory, and a pig farm, and stayed in private homes, saw the San Francisco Ballet perform. And he happened to be here during a debate between Carter and Reagan. And so he watched that with a family and got a feel for politics in America. But here's the interesting thing. He stopped at a Amana colony. Now, you may all remember Amana appliances. We visited friends in Iowa, and they took us to an Amana colony. And the Amanas, they came over with a lot of idealism and wanted to start communes, much like we wanted to do back in the 60s, right? Let's all go to a commune. But the Amana people actually did it. They came from Germany, and they did farm on a communal basis for a long time. And Xi's father knew that, and he asked to go to the Amana colonies, where his host observed him to be the most engaged that he was of any stop on the trip, because he he was fascinated by what he thought to be American communism, which it kind of was in the early days. And this is the way the Amana colony presents itself now. They're no longer a commune. In the 1930s, they privatized, and nevertheless, they kept their communal spirit. And this photo here with the horse-drawn carriages is the 1880s in Amana colony. This is when they were still communal. And this is Xi's father on that trip in 1980. Indiana had something like that too, called New Harmony, Robert Owen. And I think a lot of states did. We know the Amish in Pennsylvania, and they introduced progressive thought as well. So in Indiana, this never came to fruition. A version of it did, but they had ambitions in education and science and even in entertainment, and a public school that was open to boys and girls. And it eventually failed. Of course, now in our minds is the kibbutz, some of whom were attacked in October. But we remember that. And then here's the thing. Xi's father went back to China, and he thought that China should do some version of privatization of communes. And they still had communal farms. That's what the Cultural Revolution was all about, to strengthen the communal farms. But gradually, Deng Xiaoping and Xi's father realized that wasn't going to work. Xi's father was the governor of Guangdong province, one of the biggest provinces, and was in charge of the early economic reforms. And this shows him visiting a communal farm in the process of being privatized. And we all know how that turned out, wildly successful. All right, so I forgot to, Carol's coming. And then this is Xi with his father now, who's obviously elderly. And then, like father, like son. So only 5 years after his father had been there, in 1985, Xi went to Iowa as part of an agricultural delegation. His official group was an animal feed association. And you see him here. He stayed in a home, and staying in with an Iowa family gives you a pretty nice introduction to America. I don't know how it is today, but this is him with a very stolid Iowa farming family. And I think he stayed with a local family the most. Their son had gone away to college, so he got to sleep in a teenager's room complete with Star Wars figures. And that really paid off for this little town. Their high school students have been welcome in Beijing and invited to dine with Xi and his family, and even one became a business consult but unfortunately, he got caught in the Trump backlash, and so it hasn't. It's no longer a productive endeavor for him. And then this was she, and as part of a work brigade, he was doing this all the time during the Cultural Revolution. But as he was working his way up as a princeling, he had a lot of experience on the communal farms. So she went back in 2012 during the Obama years, and this was even more productive. He was now in power, and or was just coming into power. Actually, I think it was a few months shy of being in power, but his hosts were really impressed at how much he could discuss in detail globalization. And they had a problem with translation, and the colorfully they got down on the dirt and drew pictures and scratched drawings in the sand to explain what they were trying to understand about processing corn and operating tractors. Um, and he was able to hold forth on how China had used computers and machines that he had learned about in the 1980s. And on this trip in 2012, that was still in the happy years of Obama. They signed a 5-year deal of cooperation. And here he is with a farmer named Kimberly, who he really bonded with. And to the extent that he got to drive one of Kimberly's tractors against the advice of his Secret Service. They didn't want, nor did our Secret Service want him to take a risk and injure himself. But Kimberly and he defied everybody, the authorities, and climbed into the tractor, and she drove it. There's a lingering goodwill here. There's a business school, agriculturally focused, that's named after Kimberly in this province. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Shanxi. And thousands of people now come to Iowa and find Kimberly's farm, and ask to sit in the tractor, which Kimberly ordinarily would have recycled into the used tractor lot, but he's kept it as a tourist attraction, and the Chinese want to have it shipped to a museum. So that's how much goodwill there was between Xi, and it was renewed in San Francisco. So that was interesting. And Xi has said when he's meeting with ordinary Americans that you all are the real America. He bonded with the Iowa governor from the 1980s, and Trump made that guy the ambassador to China, which was turned out to be a thankless task. But and I think it's with these people that he met in San Francisco, although I don't have a picture of that. I don't even know if they exist. But the former governor of Iowa has expressed his disappointment that they had been led to believe that he was going to continue to be a reformer like his father had been after dismantling the communal farms the way Manna people had done. But unfortunately, that's not the way things are going And then she saw the real America when he visited Mar-a-Lago in 2017. All right, so that's my end of the aside that I couldn't resist on. She's friends with Iowan farmers, and it was just I kept pulling on the thread and going deeper down the rabbit hole to mix my metaphors, and I hope you found some illuminating. The Today, obviously, he didn't go back to an Iowa farm, and he would have a very different reception. But it was good enough in San Francisco, so I was proud that we could give him a good time. And I guess they had their highest level meetings on the Fioli residence. Someday when we get to that point in California history, we can talk about the influence of the Fioli family in San
By
Jose.
Lowly.
Thank you.
And hey, John, I just got to pipe in. So I did med and grad school in Iowa and spent 2 months in an Amish community with a family doctor as a sub-I, and got to know the community pro. This is during the 80s when she visited. I was there 83 to 89 and Amish, but they were, at least as well as in 89, they were still self-insured for healthcare. And so when one of the elders had a heart attack, they actually had to have a meeting of this town, Cologne, Iowa, about 2,000 Amish, to decide if they should keep him in the hospital because it was very expensive. And indeed, they decided to bring him home, and he survived. But they still, in the 80s, had horse and buggy. And there's still quite a bit of collectivism in terms of the towns, the small towns. So just interesting that you brought up Iowa, because I spent 6 years there.
Yeah, that's right. I'd forgotten that. Thanks for reminding me. You were in Iowa City, and of course, that's where my literary hero Kurt Vonnegut wound up in his formative years. So
right, and it was also the time during which an occasional farmer was told to leverage his farm to buy a new tractor, didn't like it, and then walked into a bank and shot the bank teller. There was the collapse. Well, the collapse of the farms was also happening, and the big industrial move towards mega farms was happening. So, interesting time in Iowa.
Wow. Okay, that's an interesting sidelight. We have such an interesting group with varying backgrounds and experiences and abilities in English to keep me pronouncing things correctly.
Well, it comes from fight, love, live. Phi, Lo, Li. It's the 2 letters.
Phi, Lo, Li. Ah.
Okay. All right. Well, Rudy has actually tried to teach me that, but maybe this time it'll stick. All right. Excellent. Okay. So I think that was the end of my aside, and we can get back to Junipero Serra, who we started last week, and I was just about ready to contrast him with Kino. We had talked about the fortunes of and the controversy around Junipero Serra's statues, both in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C. And we had talked about his sainthood and how controversial that was. And Pope Francis, who, by the way, is not a Franciscan, who is a Jesuit, Father Kino is in the works to become a saint himself, and there's not any controversy because he was a very different he ran a very different kind of mission. And that's what we're going to go into. We're going to start our deep dive on why Eusebio Kino was so different than another missionary, Junipero Serra. And it's quite an interesting story, and we've already emphasized enough that Kino was a Jesuit and Serra was a Franciscan. So he's got a statue in Washington, D.C., and this is the one that Arizona put up without any controversy at all in 1965, and there's been no talk of taking his statues down. Now, California and Arizona are very different politically, so obviously. But like Junipero Serra, he put up 20 missions. But he was a philosopher and a scientist from the Enlightenment, very much from the Enlightenment. And the Jesuits were a very different kind of missionaries than the Franciscans. You're going to hear later on that Serra was not tolerant of Native American superstitions or spiritual practices at all. But the Jesuits were famously tolerant and tried to work within the folklore and the pantheon of the local gods that the natives worshipped. So they were much more enlightened that way, and that's one of the reasons we don't hear any stirrings of protest against Kino. He's the padre on horseback, and he was seen by Native Americans as a defender. And so he's on his way to uncontroversial sainthood. This, by the way, I pointed out every state gets 2 statues. And last week, I showed the other statue beside Serra, who still stands in the Capitol, probably because Pope Francis blessed them there and went and took a look at the statue and had strong political backing from both Kevin McCarthy and John Boehner, the speaker before him. Serra still stands, but he's not. His statue's been removed in Sacramento. Every state gets 2. Our other one is Reagan, and their other one is Goldwater, 2 conservatives. I was asked who makes these decisions, and I haven't been able to find out. I don't know if anybody else looked it up, but this is Goldwater as representing the other statue for Arizona and Washington, D.C. Serra's statues still stand in a number of places. Surprisingly, when we visited Cuba about 10 years ago, we went to visit the main square there, and there's a Franciscan friary there in the main square, and right in front is a statue of Serra in downtown Havana. His statue remains in places where he was born, and that's Majorca. I'm going to talk a lot about Majorca because it's a unique place, and I think it makes Serra more understandable when you understand what his background was. But his actual birthplace was in the middle of Majorca. I'll show you a map in just a second. In a small town, Petra. And then the capital is on the coast, Palma in Majorca. This is what Serra's famous for, the 20 missions in Alta California. And we're going to be going through those. It'll probably take us quite a few weeks to understand the sequence and what happened. But just a quick review of what's the controversy. We saw the result of the controversy, and the critiques are, hey, Serra made conversion mandatory in some situations. It wasn't always positive. If you wanted to get food, you had to convert. And then once you converted, there was, and he admits it, there were examples of abuse. But all of the behavior of the Franciscans was colored by what they believed and what the era believed would happen to unbaptized infants. And their belief wasn't always backed up by any kind of theology. Probably the leading theologian that had an opinion on that was St. Augustine. And he thought that if a pagan infant died, he would only get the mildest chastisements in hell, but he wouldn't get a reward. So a lot of the action was motivated by these, what seemed to us today like kind of strange beliefs. But the indictment would be that while the Jesuits worked within the native cultures, Serra tried to suppress. It was more on suppressing. Also, after Native Americans converted, they were expected to work in the missions and in the fields around the missions. And we know from Connie Loosely that many of them ran away, especially the Miwoks were particularly hard to hold and work in a scheduled work habit. Hunter-gatherers get to work when they feel like it, but if you got to milk the cow at a certain part of the day, and you have to harvest a particular kind of year, and that's tough. And I think it's a problem with developing economies around the world, societies that are trying to bootstrap themselves up into using an agriculture lifestyle, find that this is a universal problem. The other attitude was corporal punishment. And we have to cut them a little bit of slack, because in 400 years ago, I think, or 300, corporal punishment was more tolerated everywhere. So you have to understand that. But the ultimate indictment is these Native Americans needed to be disciplined in their own tradition, and Native Americans did not use corporal punishment on their children. So that should have been taken more into account. Now, we'll go through all this and more after we get the background. We'll also learn more on the positive stuff about teaching and literacy, and also we'll learn that the people of the church were actually actively defending Native Americans from buccaneer soldiers. You can imagine armed young men thousands of miles away from home were quite often a problem. And Serra's establishment of the second mission, the first mission will be in San Diego. The second was supposed to be in Monterey. But he deliberately moved it away from Monterey, where the soldiers were billeted, to Carmel, to the Carmel River, to get the Indians away from the depredations of the soldiers, but also to have a better chance to teach them agriculture. And even after the Native Americans in San Diego, the Kumeyaw, who were always the most distrustful, in contrast to the Chumash, who lived up in the Channel Islands, that whole community up there was more agriculture, was more village oriented, and was more welcoming of the Spanish. The Kumeyaw were strictly nomads that were only in San Diego a certain time of year. And they were, that was a very bad place to try to put up the first mission. And Serra paid for it. The Kumeyaw burned down the first mission and killed everybody they could find. And in the light of that, Serra turned the cheek. At least in that sense, he was following the New Testament. All right, so Majorca, here it is. It's far away from Spain. It's almost as close to Sardinia as it is to Valencia. Smack dab in the middle of this part of the Mediterranean, which meant that the Barbary pirates could get up there too. Later on. But this is a very different world than being in the middle of Spain. And when it comes time to hear the final arguments for or against Serra, we have to take that into account. So I said Parma, that's the capital that's on the coast. Petra is right in the middle. The Majorcans made an outsized contribution to the development of Franciscan California. And it started in 1769 with Serra going to San Diego. And it lasts all the way through the first few years of the American period. This appraisal was written a long time ago, but it was closer to the period, and they found out that there had been 128 Franciscan missionaries that had gone through this College of San Fernando in Mexico City, and most of them were from Majorca, and that the Majorcan contingent had Christianized close to 100,000 Indians. So Majorca, an outsized influence. And it was started in 1734, and Junipero Serra came a couple of decades later. The Majorca. So there's a Minorca, which is smaller, but Majorca, and there's Ibiza, all part of the Balearic Islands. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. But the history of these islands, just bear in mind, it was settled first by the Phoenicians, who gave us our alphabet. And not our alphabet, but a alphabet. And then there was Carthage and Hannibal and the Punic Wars with Rome. And they're sitting out in the middle of the Mediterranean, watching the ships go by, and occasionally being pulled in to the proceedings. So the Rome falls, the barbarians take over, the Vandals probably loot everything that's not attached to the ground. But the Orthodox a church operating out of Byzantium, out of what would later become Istanbul. The troops from Constantinople get a foothold and give the Roman Empire a second wind. So if you figure that the first Roman Empire, centered in Rome, lasted almost 1,000 years, and the second Roman Empire, and it's maybe a misnomer, it's the Orthodox version of it, centered in Constantinople, lasts almost another 1,000 years. 2,000 years is a pretty good run. But Majorca is sitting right there, and they're folded back into Christianity. And then the Islamic period, the Emirate of Cordoba in particular, folds Majorca in. So there's plenty of evidence of Islamic influence, both good and bad. You'll remember that it's Cordoba that keeps alive Greek textbooks, kept that alive and developed it and reproduced it at a time when other parts of Europe were occupied by barbarians. And when you look at the early Renaissance, the scholars from the city-states of Italy, and one of the early ones was Dante, the first thing they do is hightail it over to Cordoba and take a look at the classical textbooks that have been preserved. And some of those may have been in libraries in Majorca. So I mentioned the Barbary pirates, and I depict it here, and there's watchtowers all over Majorca. So what's going on with Spain? The last time we were thinking about Spain in a concentrated way was after Cabrillo. We went through Sir Francis Drake, and we went to Viscano, and Aiko has just joined us. She's been at a Christmas party. I'm not gonna go down this rabbit hole about European politics in Spain. Just understand that from the peak period when we were talking about the Habsburgs, that they've had a really bad run, and probably it was just the curse of natural resources, the curse of having too much silver. They just pulled way too much silver out of those mines in Peru and Potosi, and inflation allowed them to buy too much in the way of Chinese luxuries. Just ruined them. So be careful what you wish for. So they had, since we had last talked of Viscano, who was the Spanish response to Sir Francis Drake. Remember, the English sent him around, and one of his jobs was as a pirate to raid the Spanish Manila galleons. Their response was to send Vizcano back up to America to look for ports. And Vizcano, his main accomplishment was he renamed a lot of things. I'll give you an example in just a second. But he misinformed. He was supposed to find great harbors for the Spanish galleons. And he had mistakenly said and overpraised Monterey as a great harbor, describing it like you would, oh, I don't know, San Francisco if they had discovered it. But once his successors got back there and realized Monterey was not nearly as protected as he had said it was, they hung his map maker. Those were tough times. So Viscano, 150 years since him, and it's been downhill all the way. Without going into the detail, all we know is that the Jesuits have been perking along in the 1600s in Baja. Witness,
thank you.
Witness Kino. But all you need to know is the Bourbons have taken over the throne of Spain. I'm not going to go into that, except they were a descendant of the Capetians that preceded Charlemagne even. But it was very complicated. So not only was Charles III the king of Spain, but you get cross-eyed trying to figure out that he's also Charles the First, king of Naples, Charles the Seventh, king of Sicily, and God knows what. But it doesn't seem to be any real power, and we're going to learn that he's eventually going to inherit from a war in Florida that was part of the 7 Years' War. He is, even though he was on the losing side with the French, he's eventually going to get the Mississippi. Go figure. So that's where we'll run into him next. But if you're categorizing him, he was relatively a man of the Enlightenment, but he believed in absolutism, and that's for sure, and the monarchy. But here's what he was really worried about: the Russians. The Russians, in Viscano's time, the Habsburgs have been worried about the British. But now the Spanish in Baja are worried about the Russians coming down. And they're particularly disturbed and how quickly the Russians have made it across their continent to the Pacific. Once they discovered that there were lucrative fur trading to be done, they just marched right across Siberia because the animals in Siberia, through evolution, developed very thick fur, and which brought a lot of money in the markets of China, particularly Manila. And so we learned that from, and that was reinforced when we were talking about the Carquinez Straits, and we'll eventually get to Fort Ross. So they haven't quite built Fort Ross yet. So that'll come in about 40 years. But they're mucking around enough and making themselves known enough in Alaska, particularly by enlisting the Aleutian natives to help them trap fur. So the Spanish, Charles III comes up with this a three-pronged plan. Let's put up presidios. By all means, get soldiers up there in forts, and then missions to work in tandem with the soldiers and enlist the local natives, like the Russians have, as much as possible. And then we'll give land grants to private citizens who we hope will start towns and be able to put up ranchos, which are the only way they can figure to live off the land. People like the Miwoks and the Chumash have figured out how to live off the land without any problem, but that's beyond the rough and tumble Spaniards that make it. So they're going to put up a land expedition to California, and that's where Junipero Serra is going to make his first real big splash in history. And this is Portola's expedition. He's a Catalan soldier. By the way, Catalonia generally has controlled Majorca. So there's that. And he heads up from, he's to get to San Diego and go on up to Monterey. And up they go, 63 people, and one of them will be Junipero Serra. So now we go back to his biography, and who was he? And how was he going to be able to respond to this big opportunity of his life? And we'll at least get started on that. So this is where he's born, right in the middle of the island, isolated. This is Palma on the southwest coast of Majorca, sitting out there in the Mediterranean. And as fate would have it, his house was a block away from the Franciscan friary. And we're going to learn that the Franciscans practically run the island. So he is very active in the local church and attends their school, their religious school. And he's very good at studies, and he's particularly taken with the spirituality of the Gregorian chant. What were the influences? So he received his doctorate in theology at Palma, where the Lilian College was, and that had been founded a couple of hundred years before by a very interesting intellectual, Ramon Lull. And he once Serra got there, he was a high performer academically, and before you knew it, he occupied the top chair of philosophy, which was the Duns Scotus chair. Yes, a Scotsman. Had been one of the major theologians of that time. Now he gets a great start in Palma, and he is at the top of the heap within 10 years of graduating. But when he's 35, he gets this itch to go to the New World, and we'll talk about that. Interestingly, when he gets to the New World, he's demoted academically. It means a demotion. And so he has to prove himself again in his late 30s in the New World. So Ramon Lull, he died a couple of hundred years, 400 years before, but is remembered as the famous founding father of Majorcan thought. And he was, his timing was perfect. He was born into the age of the Renaissance. Interestingly, he'd been a knight during that, think man of La Mancha. He was universal. He was a Christian for sure, but he was universal in the sense that his ambition was to use logic to prove the truth of Christianity to all faiths through logic. And this is a triptych of his biography, observing the multiple crucifixions and ascending his spiritual practice. And he was famous enough that he could get audiences with the Queen, Ramon Lull. And his tomb in Palma, which Serra certainly would have visited. So who was Duns Scotus? So there, according to what I read, there were 4 giants in the High Middle Ages: Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, William of Ockham, and Duns Scotus. We know the logic of Occam through reasoning in medicine using Occam's razor, right? Occam's razor looks through all the minutia and looks for the one explanation that can line up most of the blocks, Occam's razor. But Duns Scotus I tried to read, but wow, is it abstract. And you read it and you can't remember a minute later his definition of existence, distinctions, individuality. But he sold it, and he was a Franciscan. You wouldn't think that a Franciscan would be so abstract, but he was, and celebrated for it. So Franciscans, that you ordinarily think of them as mendicants. which just means they adopt this a lifestyle of poverty. They travel around a lot. They labor to the poor in particular. They always have in mind converting souls. And it gets back to Francis himself, the original story of Francis. So around the early 1200s, he starts putting his beliefs into practice, and takes off his clothes to give to the poor. His father is saying, but you're going to get cold. The churchman is gingerly holding up a garment to protect him. But he starts this order of little brothers that find joy in poverty and celebrates Sister Earth and particularly the fauna, Franciscans' love of animals. And new developments in music and literature using the language of the common people. And the irony is that at first they're persecuted, but by the depth of the Inquisition, they were the persecutors. And we're going to see some of that in Junipero Serra. If you like the art of Giotto, St. Francis is a lot like him. We could talk about that at some other time. So, and it wasn't just the fellas. Clare of Assisi started nunneries. I found this interesting when I reviewed this a couple of years ago when we were doing our unit on Italian city-states and the Renaissance, that Clare of Assisi in 1958 had been declared the saint of TV. So I don't know why TV would need a saint, but there you are. Another Franciscan that surprised me a little bit was Roger Bacon, who was more of a scientist. But he was a Franciscan at Oxford. So, all right. So I think this is a good place to stop. When we start, we'll start with Teresa of Avila. Or Avila, somebody correct my pronunciation, and the direct influences on Junipero Serra, and you're going to see that there's a heavy dose of the mystical, and so this we'll start with Teresa next week. So I'll stop share and open up the floor.
Question.
Aiko.
You said that they got the furs, but it was a big thing in Manila, but it's hot in Manila. So was that a major trading post or what?
Yeah, Manila was a new trading city that I think had been built maybe in cooperation with China, but they realized that they needed a place to trade that could accommodate the Manila galleons, but that would be close enough to be safe from pirates.
I think you had previously mentioned the trade from California to Manila of,
Yes.
was it beaver belts? At the last time that California had a trade surplus, I guess, with China.
Yeah.
Well, it's a surprise, as you said, John, that Roger Bacon was a Franciscan, which then went into such a mystical direction.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of contradictions. All right. So we'll see you next week with Teresa.
Okay. That's beyond my immediate knowledge here, I guess. This is all new to me. So that's my engineering part coming out of, I guess,
Yeah, that just to help us understand why Serra was the way he was and why he was so controversial, and understand what's in the newspapers and why people are tearing down statues.
Will we hear more next week about the differences between Kino and Serra?
Yeah, that'll be a running theme all along. The by then, Serra's given his political power to replace the Jesuits. So it won't be an ongoing conflict in Baja California. I guess the Jesuits left pretty peacefully. There had been a revolt against them 30 years before, and a number of Jesuits had been massacred, not too far from Cabo San Lucas. So where people go for their wonderful holidays. And you hear about the politics more in Europe, and of course we saw that, and we've talked about that in the movie The Missionary, about the Jesuits in South America. That movie starring Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons, which is very good. The Mission, yeah. So it was more an ongoing problem there, Homer. It doesn't come up that much. We don't hear much a peep from the Jesuits. No sign of regret. No, I think they just pulled up sticks and went back to Europe and crossed it off.
Did Father Kino ever become a saint?
He's in the process.
Oh, really?
So he's been what do you got to be beatified and canonized, and there's a first step that I think you have to be named venerable, beatified and canonized, and I think he's been named venerable and beatified, and nobody's raising a peep. You know, the interesting thing is you hear about the devil, someone playing the devil's advocate, and that is an official title. I don't know who every process of canonization has to have a devil's advocate. And you know who the devil's advocate against Mother Teresa was? Well, it may not be familiar to everybody. Christopher Hitchens was named the devil's advocate, who is appointed by the church to go and try to dig up the dirt so they don't have to regret anything later on.
Well, he was anti-church anyway, right?
Well, that at the time he was named, the Pope was big-minded enough to say, let's find a guy who really might say something bad. Yeah. All right.
Thank you, John.
Okay. Good to see you all. See you next week.
Here. Bye.
Thank you, John.
You betcha. Stop recording.